Tuscany, Italy. April 5, 1945, 0500 hours. A draw on the western slopes below a medieval stone fortress the maps call Castle Aginolfi. First Lieutenant Vernon Baker is 25 years old. He has been climbing since before dawn through coastal fog, uphill, toward a German strongpoint that 3 previous American attacks have already failed to take. Behind him are about 25 men. By the account of the National World War II Museum, roughly 70% of them are replacements who have never been in combat before. He leads the weapons platoon of Company C, 1st Battalion, 370th Infantry Regiment. He is the only black officer in that company, in an American army that has segregated him, in a division that much of the American High Command privately expects to fail. Within 2 hours, his group has reached the south side of a draw about 250 yards from the castle walls. Baker sees 2 cylindrical objects protruding from a slit in an earthen mound. He crawls underneath the opening. He puts the muzzle of his M1 rifle into the slit and empties the clip. He kills the 2 men inside. It was an observation post, and the cylindrical objects were the lenses of their optics. He moves on. He finds a camouflaged machine gun nest. The crew is eating breakfast. He kills them. His company commander, Captain John Runyon, comes forward. As the 2 men stand there, a German soldier appears and throws a grenade at them. It fails to explode. Baker shoots him twice as he tries to run. Baker goes down into the draw alone. There is a dugout. He blasts it open, shoots the German who emerges, throws a grenade inside, then goes in after it firing a submachine gun and kills 2 more. Then the hill answers. German machine guns and mortars, on positions the Americans still cannot see, open on the draw. By the time it stops, roughly 2/3 of the 25 men Vernon Baker climbed that hill with are dead or wounded. Somewhere in there, a sniper kills his only medic. Captain Runyon tells Baker that he is going back for reinforcements. In his memoir, written half a century afterward, Baker described watching him go. He wrote that he stared long and hard at the captain as he was given that story, and that Runyon then trudged away and disappeared forever into the late morning haze. No reinforcements came, no resupply came. The artillery had stopped. There was no observer and no radio. So Vernon Baker was left standing on a hillside in Tuscany with what was left of a platoon, most of it on the ground, a fortress above him he could not take, and a German defensive system that had every advantage of ground and knew exactly where he was. It is worth understanding what he was attacking, because it explains why 3 attacks had already failed there. Castle Aginolfi is a medieval fortress on a hilltop above Montignoso, near the town of Massa, in the Versilia region of Tuscany. It sits east of the coastal highway, and it looks down on everything. Its slopes are ringed with old spiral walls of stone and mortar that shrug off bombs and shell fire. The Germans had made it the anchor of a network of machine gun nests, mortar pits, bunkers, and sniper positions on the western end of the Gothic line, the defensive belt they had built across the northern Apennines from coast to coast. The positions were sighted by professionals, dug into the folds of the hillside, and the men climbing toward them could not see them. The ground was held by elements of the German 148th Grenadier Division, with attached Italian coastal units, and the attack Vernon Baker was part of, in the first week of April 1945, was a diversion. It was meant to draw German reserves toward the coast and away from the main Allied blow falling elsewhere. That is the situation. A fortified hilltop, held by veterans, on the far end of a line that was about to break anyway, attacked as a feint, by a division that its own commanding general did not believe in. Every principle of tactics taught by every army on earth in 1945 agreed on what Baker should do next. Break contact. Take the men who can still walk. Leave the rest. He did not leave the rest. He organized the withdrawal in 2 groups. He covered the first group out, the walking wounded, and then he stayed behind on that hill to get the seriously wounded off it. He deliberately occupied an exposed position, in the open, and drew German fire onto his own body, so that men who could no longer fight could be carried down behind him. On the way, he destroyed 2 more machine gun positions with grenades, positions his own attack had bypassed on the way up. That is not a dramatization. That is, almost word for word, what the United States Army eventually wrote in his Medal of Honor citation. He covered the evacuation of the wounded personnel of his company by occupying an exposed position and drawing the enemy's fire. Now think about what that sentence actually describes, stripped of all its sentiment. An officer, outnumbered, on ground he cannot hold, with 2/3 of his platoon down, chose to raise his own probability of dying in order to raise the probability that men who could no longer fire a weapon would be carried off a hill that his army was about to give up anyway. He traded a functioning officer and the risk to the men still holding rifles for casualties who could contribute nothing to the outcome of that battle or any battle that week. In the cold arithmetic of war, that is not a decision. That is an error. There is not a staff college in Europe in 1945 that would have marked it as anything else. The United States Army gave him its highest award for valor for doing it. And here is where this stops being a story about one brave man and becomes something much stranger. Vernon Baker was not an aberration. He was not a lone romantic in an army of accountants. Across every theater of that war, American units did this over and over, at costs that are genuinely difficult to justify on any tactical ledger anyone has ever drawn up. American soldiers went back for the wounded when the wounded were, in the coldest sense, worthless. American units accepted heavy casualties in order to recover casualties. In the mountains of eastern France in October 1944, an American regiment fought for days and lost hundreds of men to reach 211 trapped soldiers who could no longer fight, and the commander who ordered it had a fairly clear idea of what it was going to cost before he gave the order. So the question is not whether Americans were brave. Every army in that war was full of brave men. The German army was full of brave men. The Japanese army was full of men who died in ways that make the word brave feel inadequate. Courage is the least distinguishing feature of the Second World War. It is everywhere. It explains nothing. The question is, why one army, alone among the great armies of that war, built an entire industrial and institutional machine around an act that was, judged strictly as tactics, irrational. The easy answers are all wrong, and they need to be killed now, before they follow us any further. It was not superior American morality. Vernon Baker fought for an army that had segregated him. When he first tried to enlist in 1941, a recruiter told him there were no quotas for his people. He was decorated in 1945 with the Distinguished Service Cross, and at that ceremony, by his own account, the white officers being decorated occupied the place of honor. His army would then wait 52 years to give him the Medal of Honor, for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with what he did on that hill. This was not a morally superior institution. This was an institution with a set of blind spots so profound that they are still difficult to look at directly. It was not a formal rule either. There is a widespread belief that the American military of the Second World War operated under a doctrine of leave no man behind, and that this was a standing order soldiers were trained to obey. It was not. Go and look at the field manuals. Field Manual 100-5, the capstone document that taught American officers how to think about operations, published in 1941 and revised in 1944, is organized around the mission and the destruction of the enemy. Recovery of the wounded appears there as a function of the medical service. It is not a moral absolute that overrides the objective. The phrase that everyone now associates with the American military is a later construction. It hardened into a creed during and after Vietnam, and it has been projected backward onto a war that never used it. In 1945, no American officer was obeying a written rule that told him to stay with his wounded. There was no such rule to obey. And it was not that American soldiers loved each other more than German or Japanese soldiers did. The evidence points the other way. German small unit cohesion was, by the assessment of the American Army's own analysts, formidable. Japanese unit loyalty was so absolute that it produced mass suicide in preference to capture. So if it was not morality, and it was not doctrine, and it was not superior brotherhood, then what was it? The answer has nothing to do with that hillside. It has nothing to do with heroism. It begins in 1920, on a quiet post in Pennsylvania, in an army so small and so unloved that it could barely afford the mules that pulled its ambulances. And it begins with a question that almost nobody in the American military wanted asked, because every honest answer to it was expensive, unglamorous, and of no obvious use to anyone trying to win a battle. The question was this: what, exactly, is a wounded man worth? Before we go to Pennsylvania, the act itself has to be taken seriously, because it is very easy to underestimate. And the only way to take it seriously is to be precise about what it cost. Understand first who Vernon Baker was before that ridge. He was born on December 17, 1919, in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Both his parents were killed in a car accident when he was 4. He was raised by his grandparents. After the recruiter turned him away, he went back and got in. He trained at Camp Walters in Texas. He went to officer candidate school at Fort Benning, and after 13 weeks, he was commissioned a second lieutenant on January 11, 1943. He was assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, the only African-American infantry division to see sustained combat in Europe. He arrived at Naples on July 28, 1944. That October he was wounded in the arm and spent 2 months in a general hospital at Pisa. Then he went back to the line. Now, the 92nd Division has a contested reputation, and this script is not going to dodge it, because the truth here is more damning than the myth. The record shows real failures. There were units that broke. There were unauthorized withdrawals. The division's February 1945 offensive in the Serchio Valley failed. The United States Army's own official history of black troops in that war, written by the historian Ulysses Lee and published in 1966, documents low morale and units that fell apart under pressure, and records that the American command concluded the division was fit mainly for defensive work. But look at what was actually done to that division before it ever fired a shot. Its soldiers were black. Almost all of its senior officers were white, many of them Southern, many of them openly resentful at having been given the assignment, and a great number of them convinced before they arrived that the men they commanded could not fight. Officers rotated constantly, so that soldiers often did not know the man giving them orders. The division was deliberately filled with poorly educated draftees, whose low scores on the Army's classification tests measured nothing except the segregated American school systems that had produced them. And the division's commanding general, Edward Almond, repeatedly disparaged the fighting ability of his own men. He would advise the Army after the war against using black soldiers as combat troops at all. That is the machine that Vernon Baker was placed inside. A division designed, staffed, and led in a manner that made failure likely, commanded by a man who did not believe in it, and then blamed for failing. And this same division, across roughly 9 months of combat, took something on the order of 3,200 casualties of its own, and produced, eventually, 2 Medals of Honor. Hold that contradiction in your mind, because it is the engine of everything that follows. The men Vernon Baker was carrying down that hill belonged to an army that did not believe they were soldiers, and that same army was, at that exact moment, spending enormous quantities of blood plasma, penicillin, and skilled surgical labor to keep them alive. Which brings us to the second black officer in that division, and to the day, 3 months before Baker's Hill, when the arithmetic of the wounded was pushed to its absolute limit. Summer Colonia, December 26, 1944. First Lieutenant John Fox was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, on May 18, 1915. He went first to Ohio State, then transferred to Wilberforce University, a historically black institution, because Wilberforce had a reserve officer training program that would actually admit black cadets. He was commissioned on June 13, 1940. He married a nursing student named Arlene. They had a daughter, Sandra. He was a forward artillery observer, attached from Cannon Company of the 366th Infantry to the 598th Field Artillery Battalion. In late December 1944, he volunteered to go into the mountain village of Somocolonia in the Serchio Valley. On Christmas night, German and Italian troops began infiltrating the village. Some of them came in wearing civilian clothes. By early morning, much of the village was in enemy hands. At around 4 in the morning, the formal attack began. Most of the American infantry pulled out of the town. John Fox and his observation party did not. They stayed, and they directed artillery fire. It is worth being exact about where they stayed, because the official record is wrong. Fox's Medal of Honor citation places him on the second floor of a house. Decades of research into that battle by the historian Solis Wales, corroborated by a fellow artilleryman who trained him, and by the diary of an Austrian soldier who was in the village that morning, establishes that he was directing fire from the top of Somocolonia's medieval stone tower, a structure called La Rocca. The error appears to have entered the record because another officer, working from Fox's map coordinates, assumed they matched an observation post he had used himself. That is a small thing, and it changes nothing about what Fox did, but it is worth saying out loud because the citation is the only monument most of these men have, and it took the army 52 years to write his. From the tower, as the enemy came into the streets in strength, Fox called the fire in closer and closer. He told his battalion commander that the last barrage had landed where he wanted it, and asked him to bring it in 60 yards nearer. The commander protested that this would be too close. Fox gave the correction anyway. Then he cut the distance in half. The Germans surrounded the position. Fox called for artillery a final time. His commander protested again and told him plainly that the fire would land on him. The last message ever received from First Lieutenant John Fox was this: "Fire it. There are more of them than there are of us." When American forces retook Somocolonia, they found his body, and the bodies of his party, in the ruins where his position had been. His citation states that the barrage killed roughly 100 German soldiers. That figure is an estimate, and it is disputed. The researchers who have gone through the Italian records found a partial list of 41 Axis dead, and a local estimate of perhaps 70 to 80 in total, not all of them killed by Fox's guns. What is not in dispute is that his fire broke the attack in the village and bought the hours the Americans needed to reorganize the line behind him. That is the far end of the logic. That is a man who calculated that his own body was worth less than the delay his death would purchase. And here is what the American army did with that. Nothing. For 38 years, nothing at all. John Fox received no award. He was finally given the Distinguished Service Cross in 1982, 37 years after he died. Hold that thought too, because we are coming back to it. If this kind of history is worth your time, the machinery underneath the moments everyone thinks they already know, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps these longer, more detailed stories find the people who want them. Now go north, and back a few months, to the coldest and clearest demonstration of the American price. The Vosges Mountains, in eastern France, October 1944. Dense timber, fog, freezing rain, mud, steep ridges, and German positions dug in among the trees. On October 24, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Infantry Division, pushed too far along a wooded ridge. The Germans closed the corridor behind them and cut them off. 275 men were trapped on a bald ridgetop, roughly 300 yards across, surrounded, with no resupply, running out of food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies. They were, in origin, a Texas National Guard unit. The American newspapers called them the Lost Battalion. The division commander was Major General John Dahlquist, and he had committed that battalion against the advice of his own senior officers. Now he needed someone to go and get them out. The unit he sent was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The 442nd was made up of second-generation Japanese-American soldiers. As they fought in those woods, Many of their own families were confined behind wire in American internment camps under Executive Order 9066, imprisoned by the government their sons were dying for. Some of those men had volunteered from inside the camps. They had just come out of 10 days of heavy fighting to take the towns of Bruyères and Bifontaine. They were exhausted, and they had been pulled back to rest. Dahlquist ordered them back into the line and told them to move out at 4 in the morning on October 27. One of the Nice veterans later recalled the pressure that came down on their regimental commander. "Get in there and get them out," the general was remembered as saying, "if it takes every last one of you to do it." It is a soldier's memory rather than a written order, and it should be treated as one, but it captures precisely what was about to be spent. The 442nd went uphill through the timber, into fog, against machine guns and mortars and mined trails, for 4 days. On October 29, on a ridge the survivors afterward called Suicide Hill, the men of I Company and K Company were pinned by German fire in a place where staying still meant being killed slowly. So they stood up and charged uphill into the guns, firing from the hip. One of the men who is credited with starting that charge, Private Barney Hajiro, would eventually receive the Medal of Honor for what he did in those woods, though he would wait 56 years for it. A soldier of K Company who was there described the charge afterward. "They yelled their heads off," he said, "and charged, and shot at everything that moved, because they did not care anymore, and they acted like a bunch of savages." On October 30, they broke through. A soldier named Matt Sakamoto reached the trapped Texans first, and the first thing he did was offer one of them a cigarette. 211 men came off that ridge alive, out of the 275 who had been cut off. Now, the cost. Popular accounts often say the 442nd lost 800 men to save 211. That figure is not sound, and this script is not going to use it, because it covers a much longer period of fighting than the rescue itself. The honest figure, from the historians who have gone back to the records, is that the rescuing battalions lost something in the region of 400 men killed and wounded during the rescue operation. That is still, roughly, 2 casualties suffered for every man recovered. And the shape of those losses is more brutal than any total can convey. Company I went into that fight with 185 men. 8 walked out of it unhurt. Company K went in with 186 men. 17 walked out. Both companies came out of those woods being led by sergeants, because every officer and senior non-commissioned officer in them had been killed or wounded. 2 rifle companies were destroyed as fighting organizations. And the men they saved were, at the moment of their rescue, of no military value at all. They were starving, frozen, exhausted, and many of them were wounded. They could not attack. They could not hold ground. In the pure logic of combat power, they were a liability, purchased at the price of an asset. There is an epilogue to this that removes any remaining comfort. The 442nd was not withdrawn afterward. It was ordered to keep attacking for another 9 days, in the same terrain, and it fell to roughly a third of its strength before a higher commander finally pulled it out of the line on November 17. And on November 12, Dahlquist ordered the regiment to assemble on parade so that he could formally recognize it. He looked at the thin ranks in front of him and demanded that all the men be made to stand for the formation. The regiment's commander, Colonel Virgil Miller, had to tell him that this was all that was left. Fewer than 20 men stood where K Company should have been. If you were a German staff officer, and you had been handed the ledger for that operation, you would have concluded that the American army had lost its mind. Hundreds of first-rate infantrymen expended to recover 211 men who could not fight, on ground of negligible value, by an army that then kept attacking until the rescuers themselves were destroyed. And this is exactly where most tellings of this story reach for the comfortable explanation, that the Americans were simply better people, that they valued human life more. The surest proof that this explanation is false is the identity of the men doing the rescuing. The soldiers of the 442nd were bleeding to death in a French forest to save the army that had imprisoned their mothers and fathers behind barbed wire in the Californian desert. Whatever was driving that, It was not a warm feeling of national brotherhood. Nothing so simple was operating here. Something structural was. To find it, we have to leave the battlefield entirely and go back to Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, in the year 1920. The war that had just ended was, in the memory of the men who had survived it, a particular kind of abattoir. Soldiers in the First World War were not simply killed. They were wounded, and then they died slowly, of infection, of shock, of blood loss, of the hours and the days that passed between the moment a shell fragment entered a body and the moment a surgeon finally looked at it. The number that haunted American military medicine after 1918 is this one. Of American soldiers who were wounded and who actually reached the medical system alive, roughly 8.1% then died of those wounds. 1 man in 12 who made it as far as a doctor died anyway. Everyone in military medicine understood the cause, and the cause was not surgery. It was time. It was the interval between the wound and the operating table. A wound that a surgeon could handle easily 2 hours after it was inflicted became a death sentence at 8 hours, not because the wound had changed, but because the body had. In 1920, the American Army took over Carlisle Barracks and established the Medical Field Service School there. The first basic course ran in June 1921. Its purpose was narrow, technical, and profoundly unfashionable. It did not exist to advance surgical science. It existed to work out how to move a wounded man from the place where he fell to the place where a surgeon stood, faster than the wound could kill him. Nothing about this was glamorous. The school's motto was to conserve fighting strength, a phrase that tells you precisely how it had to justify its own existence to an army that cared about winning battles rather than saving men. Its officers studied litter carries, ambulance loading points, and the geometry of collecting stations. The first commandant, according to the Army's own medical historians, had not particularly wanted the job. He would have preferred laboratory work to field work and tactics. The institution he ran was starved. The American Army between the wars was a marginal, underfunded thing, ranked well down the list of the world's armies, cut to the bone through a depression that spared nothing. Field medical training was, in the judgment of the Army's own official history, the medical department's most striking training deficiency in the years before the war. Demonstrations were run by a handful of understrength units. At Carlisle, the 1st Medical Regiment taught evacuation using ambulances pulled by mules, 4 mules to an ambulance, loading imaginary casualties at imaginary ambulance posts, watched by officers who would spend most of their careers never seeing a real one. This is what institutional obscurity actually looks like. There is no dramatic rejection. There is just a small building, a small budget, a commandant who would rather be somewhere else, and the slow, patient accumulation of unfashionable knowledge that nobody in the wider army is paying any attention to. And yet what was being assembled there, year after year, was a genuinely radical proposition, and it was this. A wounded soldier is not a loss to be written off. He is a resource in transit. And if you build a machine that can move him fast enough, most of him comes back. Almost nobody outside that school took the idea seriously in 1921. The system that came out of it, refined through the 1930s and hardened in the first battles of the next war, was not a rescue service. It was a conveyor belt. At the very front, inside the rifle company itself, was the company aid man. Every American infantry company carried its own, normally 2 of them, unarmed, marked with a red cross, living in the same holes and walking over the same ground as the rifleman. He was not attached from the rear when things got bad. He belonged to the company. He was theirs. The men called him Doc. His training got longer as the war went on. It was as short as 8 weeks in early 1942. By August 1943, it had been pushed out to 17. He carried a canvas pouch containing Carlisle dressings, named for the very post where the system had been designed, along with sulfur powder, morphine, bandage scissors, and from 1944, a tourniquet. Behind him, 300 to 1,000 yards back, was the battalion aid station, where a medical officer could stop bleeding, treat shock, and sought the wounded by urgency. Behind that, the collecting station. Behind that, the clearing station. Behind that, the field hospital and the evacuation hospital, where actual surgery happened. Behind that, the general hospitals. Behind them, the ship's home. Moving between them were the litter squads. 4 men to a litter, because fewer than 4 could not survive the fatigue of a long carry, and in the mountains of Italy where Vernon Baker fought, every carry was long. Every link in that chain existed to do one thing: compress time, shorten the interval between the wound and the knife. And it worked to a degree that is genuinely difficult to absorb. The proportion of wounded American soldiers who reached the medical system and then died of their wounds fell from roughly 8.1% in the First World War to roughly 3.3% in the Second. The Army's own medical historians, writing about the Mediterranean theatre, the theatre where Vernon Baker fought, stated the result in terms blunt enough to be uncomfortable. Of 112,000 wounded men, 4,000 died. The chances of surviving a battle wound in that theatre, they wrote, were 27 to 1. 27 to 1. Sit with that number for a moment, because it silently changes the meaning of everything a lieutenant was doing with his body on a hillside in Tuscany. 3 things fed that chain and made it work, and none of the 3 was invented by the army. The first was blood. In the First World War, a man who bled heavily and did not reach a transfusion in time simply died, because blood could not be stored, moved, or stockpiled at anything like the scale a battlefield demands. The answer came from a physician named Charles Drew, whose doctoral research at Columbia concerned the preservation of blood, and who had established a blood bank at Presbyterian Hospital in 1939. Between August 1940 and January 1941, Drew directed the program called Blood for Britain, which collected more than 14,000 donations and shipped over 5,000 litres of plasma across the Atlantic to a country then under German bombardment. Plasma could be dried, plasma could be stored, plasma could be carried in a satchel by a 19-year-old aide man and pushed into a soldier's vein in a ditch, in the dark, in the rain, with the shooting still going on. In February 1941, Drew became the first director of the American Red Cross Blood Bank, and he pioneered the mobile collection units that became the Bloodmobile. Here is the part that most tellings leave out. The American Armed Forces first refused to accept blood donated by Black Americans. They then agreed to accept it only on condition that it was kept segregated from the blood of white donors. Plasma from a black donor and plasma from a white donor are chemically indistinguishable, and every physician involved in that decision knew it. Drew left the Red Cross post in 1941 and returned to Howard University, and he spent the rest of his life attacking that policy in public. He called it a grievous mistake and a stupid error, and he gave 3 reasons. No department of the federal government should willfully humiliate its citizens. There is no scientific basis for the order, and they need the blood. So when Vernon Baker's wounded were carried down that Tuscan hillside and given plasma, they were being kept alive by a system designed by a black physician who had walked out of it, because it would not treat his blood as equal to a white man's. Nothing in this story is clean. The second thing was chemistry. Sulfur powder went into the pouch on the belt of every American soldier. Penicillin, which had been a laboratory curiosity for over a decade, was forced into mass production by an American industrial effort of enormous scale, tested through 1943, and used in the field in North Africa that same year. By the Normandy landings in June 1944, there was enough of it to treat every Allied soldier who needed it. Infection, which had been the reliable executioner of wounded men in every war in human history, stopped being reliable. There is an honest complication buried here, and it is worth stating because it tells you something true about how belief and evidence interact in war. The chief surgical consultant of the American forces in Europe wrote in 1943 that sulfur drugs did not, in fact, keep infection out of wounds. And yet, he noted, almost to a man, the soldiers said their lives had been saved by them. The faith ran well ahead of the evidence. Remember that. It turns out to matter enormously. The third thing was surgery pushed forward. The auxiliary surgical groups were mobile teams, typically a surgeon, an assistant, an anesthetist, a nurse, and 2 technicians, attached forward to field hospitals so that abdominal and chest wounds, the wounds that kill within hours, could be operated on near the front instead of after a long journey to the rear. A single one of those groups handled tens of thousands of casualties across the war. Now hold all of that in your head at once, and look again at an American rifle company standing at the bottom of a hill. Every man in it knew 3 things, without being told, and without any manual saying so. He knew there was a medic in his own company who would come for him. He knew there was plasma. He knew that if he was hit, the odds were overwhelming that he would live. He knew, in other words, that being wounded was not the same thing as being dead. And that is the deleted step. That is the entire story. In the German theory of war, and in the Japanese theory, and in every theory of war stretching back into antiquity, there was a sequence so basic that no one ever thought to write it down. You are hit. Then you are a casualty. Then you are, in your commander's ledger, a subtraction, a cost, something the unit has lost. The American system did not disprove that sequence. It deleted a step from the middle of it. In the American Army of 1944, a man who was hit had not yet been subtracted. He was in transit. He was, statistically speaking, still on the roster, 27-1. Which means that when Vernon Baker stood upright in the open on that ridge and pulled German fire onto himself so that his wounded could be carried down the hill, he was not making a beautiful, doomed, sentimental gesture. He was covering the withdrawal of men who were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, coming back. He was not dying for corpses. He was risking himself for soldiers. And the Army's own medical history states the mechanism plainly, without embarrassment, and without appearing to notice what it is admitting. Writing about the company aid man, it says that his mere presence in the company is a morale builder, because the men know that as long as Doc is there, they will not be left to die on the battlefield. Read that sentence again, but read it the way a weapons designer would read it. The medic is not there to save the wounded. He is there to change the behavior of the men who are not yet wounded. An infantryman who believes that being hit means dying slowly and alone in a field will hesitate before he crosses that field. An infantryman who believes that being hit means 20 minutes on a litter, plasma in his arm, and a surgeon at the other end will cross it. Not because he is braver, because he is doing different arithmetic. The guarantee of retrieval was not a kindness that the American Army extended to its soldiers. It was a device for making them advance. And this is the part that should stop you cold. Nobody designed it that way. The Medical Field Service School at Carlisle Barracks was not built to make infantrymen aggressive. It was built to bring down a mortality statistic. Charles Drew's plasma program was built to keep Britain alive under German bombs, and he spent his life afterward attacking the way his own country used it. The penicillin effort was an industrial and scientific problem, not a doctrinal one. The auxiliary surgical groups were solving a question of arithmetic about how many hours an abdominal wound can wait. 4 separate institutional projects, run by people who mostly did not know one another and were not coordinating, aimed at 4 different problems, none of which was the problem they ended up solving. They converged in the same rifle company at the same moment in 1944, and what they produced together was not medicine. What they produced was a change in what a man was willing to do with his own body. Nobody wrote it into a manual because nobody knew it needed writing. By the time anyone might have noticed, it had already happened. Now turn around and look at the men on the other side of that hill, because it would be easy and false to describe German military medicine as primitive or callous. It was neither. The Germans had their own chain. Their stretcher bearers pulled the wounded back to a casualty nest, sometimes only 20 or 25 meters behind the point of contact. From there, the wounded went to a troop dressing station, and then to a main dressing station a few miles to the rear, where 2 surgeons could operate, expandable to 6 or 8 under heavy load. with a nominal capacity of 200 patients that was routinely stretched to 300 or 400. The German Air Force ran a genuine air evacuation service, and across the war, German air transport moved something approaching 2.5 million casualties, prioritizing exactly the wounds that could not wait. Brain, eye, jaw, chest, abdomen. That is not the medical service of an army that despised its wounded. It was a competent, professional system, built by serious men who knew their business. What it could not survive was defeat. The German chain depended on the front standing still long enough for the chain to function, and from 1943 onward, on every front that mattered, the German front did not stand still. It went backward, and when a front retreats fast enough, the chain snaps. The medical historians record what that looked like at the end. Men with abdominal wounds who received no surgery at all, because the war had rolled over them before anyone could reach a surgeon. The German army did not stop caring about its wounded. It stopped being able to reach them. And a soldier does not evaluate a medical system by reading its design documents. He evaluates it by whether the man who was next to him last week is alive this week. The Japanese case is harder and more terrible, and it has to be stated accurately rather than as caricature. Early in the war, the Imperial Japanese Army possessed a genuinely sophisticated casualty evacuation structure. A revision to its operations manual in March 1940 reorganized its medical corps into casualty evacuation detachments and pushed rescue units forward toward the fighting. This was not a primitive institution, and it was not staffed by fools. What destroyed it was not incompetence, it was doctrine. The Field Service Code issued in January 1941 forbade Japanese soldiers to be taken prisoner, and from the Battle of Attu, in the Aleutian Islands, in May 1943, the pattern that came to define the Pacific War emerged. When a position was lost, the survivors made a final charge, and the wounded who could not walk were not evacuated. They were expected to die, and they were helped to do it. A Japanese medical officer on Attu, Tatsuguchi Nobuo, wrote in his diary before the end that it had been decided a final charge would be made, and that all the patients in his care were to commit suicide. That is the exact opposite pole from Carlisle Barracks, not a failure of medicine, a doctrine in which a wounded man had negative value, in which he was not a resource in transit, but an obstacle to honor. 3 armies. 3 answers to the question of what a wounded man is: an obstacle to be removed, a cost to be minimized, or an asset in temporary transit. Only one of those 3 answers produced infantry that would reliably cross open ground. If you are getting something out of this, a like helps enormously, and subscribing means the next one of these finds you. Now, the escalation, because everything described so far still contains one enormous hole, and the entire system falls into it. The chain begins with the aid man. Everything downstream of him, the plasma, the sulfur, the penicillin, the mobile surgical team, the 27-to-1, is worth precisely nothing if nobody reaches the wounded man where he lies. The whole apparatus, all of it, every institutional investment of 25 years, rests in the end on the willingness of one unarmed man in his early 20s to walk into fire. So what happened to them? They were consumed. The scholarly assessment of the company aidman's war is that most American divisions, with as much as 6 months of severe combat, suffered 100% casualties among their company aidmen. Read that again. Not heavy losses. 100%. Over 6 months of hard fighting, the man with the Red Cross on his arm was statistically certain to be hit. The foundation of the entire system was a job that killed the people who did it. Go back to that forest in the Vosges, to the days when the 442nd was climbing toward the lost battalion, and look at what one of those men was actually doing. Technician 5th grade James Okubo was a medic in the medical detachment of the 3rd Battalion of the 442nd. He was born in Anacortes, Washington. His family had been taken from their home and held at Tule Lake, and then at Hart Mountain in Wyoming. He enlisted in May 1943 and volunteered for the regiment. On October 28, 1944, in that forest, with German fire coming from behind minefields and roadblocks, Okubo crawled 150 yards forward, to within 40 yards of the German line. 2 grenades were thrown at him as he left his last piece of cover to drag wounded men back. Under continuous small arms and machine gun fire, he treated 17 men that day. He went out again the next day and treated 8 more. A week later, on November 4, he ran 75 yards through grazing machine gun fire to reach a burning tank, and pulled out a badly wounded crewman who would otherwise have died there, and treated him. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor. His command gave him the Silver Star instead, in the mistaken belief that the Silver Star was the highest award a medic was permitted to receive. Now hold Okubo in your mind, alongside the arithmetic we have been building, because he is the proof of it. Every one of those 17 men lying in that forest on October 28 was, at the moment he went down, a subtraction. Under the German theory, and under the Japanese theory, he was gone. What made him something other than gone was a young man whose family was behind American wire in Wyoming, crawling on his stomach to within 40 yards of a German machine gun with a canvas bag of dressings and morphine. That is what 27-1 actually looked like at the point of contact. It was not a hospital, it was not a statistic. It was one unarmed man in the dirt, close enough to the enemy to hear them speaking. And that is why the whole apparatus was so much more fragile than it looked. Everything the United States had built across 25 years, Carlisle and the plasma and the penicillin and the surgical teams, reached the wounded man through him and through nobody else. Kill him, and the chain does not degrade. It stops. Which brings us to the single hardest fact in this story, and to the place where the American theory reaches its absolute limit and breaks. Saipan, July 7, 1944. Captain Ben Salomon was a dentist. He was born in Milwaukee on September 1, 1914. He was an Eagle Scout. He graduated from the University of Southern California School of Dentistry in 1937. He was drafted in 1940 as an infantry private, and by every account he was extremely good at it. An outstanding shot with both rifle and pistol. In August 1942, he was commissioned into the Dental Corps, and he became the regimental dental officer of the 105th Infantry Regiment. On Saipan, in late June 1944, the surgeon of the 2nd Battalion was wounded. Ben Salomon volunteered to replace him. On the morning of July 7, the Japanese launched the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War against the American lines. Thousands of men came forward in a mass attack, whose purpose was not to win anything. Among them were their own wounded, and men carrying bayonets lashed to poles. Salomon's aid station was a tent close behind the front line. By the account in his citation, roughly 30 wounded American soldiers had walked, crawled, or been carried into it. The line in front of him collapsed. The Japanese came through the tent. He ordered the wounded evacuated, and then he stayed. He took a machine gun and held the position while the wounded were carried out behind him. When his body was recovered, 98 dead Japanese soldiers lay in front of that gun. The historian of the 27th Infantry Division, Captain Edmund Love, who investigated the scene, recorded that Salomon's body had 76 bullet wounds and many bayonet wounds, and that as many as 24 of those wounds may have been received while he was still alive and still firing. Understand what that death means inside the framework we have built. Ben Salomon was the system. He was the link in the chain. His entire function was to make the wounded man's survival routine, mechanical, statistical, a matter of 27-1. And on that morning, on Saipan, the system he embodied could not save the men lying in his tent. So he stepped outside it entirely and did the only thing that was left, which was to become a rear guard with a machine gun and buy, with his own body, the minutes that the litter bearers needed to get 30 men out. And here is the final, brutal irony. The American army refused to give him the Medal of Honor. For decades, the stated reason was that under the Geneva Conventions, a medical officer may not bear arms. The commanding general of his division rejected the recommendation on precisely those grounds. The institution that had built its entire war around the retrieval of the wounded could not, for more than half a century, bring itself to honor the man who died doing it, because he had picked up a gun. The award was finally made on May 1, 2002, 58 years afterward. So here is the forensic verdict. Vernon Baker did not make a mistake on that ridge. Neither did John Fox in that village. Neither did the 442nd in those woods. Neither did Ben Salomon in that tent. Judged as tactics, all four of those decisions look indefensible. And they look indefensible only because we are measuring them against the wrong theory of war. The German theory, and the Japanese theory, and every theory that came before them, shared an assumption so basic that nobody bothered to write it down. The assumption was that a wounded soldier is a subtraction, and once you accept that assumption, everything else follows with iron logic. If the wounded man is a subtraction, then risking an unwounded man to retrieve him is trading an asset for a liability, and no competent officer does that. The Germans were entirely correct within that framework. The Japanese took the same framework to its logical conclusion and killed their own wounded, which is monstrous, and which is also internally consistent. The Americans did not defeat that logic. They did something far stranger. They quietly removed its premise. By 1944, in the American Army, and in no other army on earth at that scale, a wounded man was not a subtraction. He was a soldier in temporary transit through a machine that would return roughly 97 of every 100 men who entered it. Retrieving him was not trading an asset for a liability. It was recovering an asset. Vernon Baker, standing exposed on that hillside, was not being sentimental. He was being correct, inside a set of facts that his enemies did not possess and could not have built on the timescale of that war. And now the part that denies everyone in this story the comfort of a heroic explanation. Nobody planned this. There was no American genius. There was no American genius. There was no visionary who wrote the doctrine. There was a collision, by accident, of four separate bureaucratic projects that were aimed at four different problems, run by people who were not talking to each other, over the course of 25 years. A neglected school at Carlisle Barracks, teaching evacuation with mule-drawn ambulances, run by a commandant who would rather have been in a laboratory. A black physician's research into blood preservation, weaponized first to keep Britain alive under German bombs, and then handed to an army that would not accept his own blood. An industrial penicillin program solving a manufacturing problem. A set of mobile surgical teams solving an equation about how many hours an abdominal wound can wait. Not one of those four was designed to make American infantry advance under fire. All four arrived in the same rifle company at the same moment. And the institutional reason the Germans never built the same thing is worth stating plainly, because it explains something much larger than this war. German military culture was organized around the judgment of the commander at the point of contact, initiative pushed downward, mission-type orders. It produced, over and over again, small unit leadership that the American army openly envied and never fully matched. But a chain of retrieval is not a tactical performance. It cannot be improvised by a brilliant lieutenant in the moment, no matter how brilliant he is. It is built over 25 years by unglamorous men in unfashionable buildings, arguing about litter carries and mortality tables, and then it is either there when the man goes down, or it is not. The Germans had superb commanders and no such chain. The Americans had a great many perfectly ordinary commanders, and the chain. Only one of those two things is available to you at 3 in the afternoon on a ridge in Tuscany, with your platoon on the ground and the machine guns still firing. There is one last thing, and it is the thing the men in this story were never told. The reason their acts made sense was not written in any manual any of them was ever issued. It was written in a mortality table. It was written in the gap between 8.1% and 3.3%. It was written in a ratio of 27:1, calculated by statisticians in offices those men never entered, on the basis of work done at a school they never attended, using a plasma system built by a physician whose own blood their army would not accept. Vernon Baker was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross by Captain Runyon, the officer who had walked down the hill and had not come back. Read that original 1945 citation today, and it is a thin, flat, generic document. It says, "He destroyed enemy installations, personnel and equipment." It gives no time. It names no one. It compresses the worst morning of a man's life into a paragraph that could describe almost anybody. Then read the Medal of Honor citation he finally received 52 years later. It is long and precise, and it names Captain Runyon. It gives the hour of the assault. It counts the machine gun nests. It records the grenade that failed to explode. It states, in the Army's own words, that he covered the evacuation of the wounded by occupying an exposed position and drawing the enemy's fire. Nothing happened on that hill between 1945 and 1997. The hill did not change. What changed was how much of it the United States Army was willing to write down. Baker stayed in the Army. After desegregation, he commanded an all-white airborne company in Korea, an assignment that would have been literally unthinkable in the Army that commissioned him. He served 27 years and retired in 1968. He then worked for more than 20 years for the Red Cross, the organization whose wartime blood program Charles Drew had built, and whose segregation policy he had condemned for the rest of his life. In 1993, the Army finally commissioned a study to ask why no Black American had received the Medal of Honor for service in the Second World War. The study found what everyone had always known. On January 13, 1997, 7 black soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor. 6 of them were dead. John Fox's widow Arlene accepted his. Vernon Baker was the only one of the 7 alive to receive his own. He was 77 years old. He said afterward that he had been an angry young man, that they had all been angry, but that they had a job to do, and they did it. He died on July 13, 2010, and he is buried at Arlington. And on that hillside below Castle Aginolfi, on the morning of April 5, 1945, the Germans held their ground, and they held it well, and they held it according to a theory of war that was professional, coherent, and entirely correct in every respect but one. They believed that a man who went down was gone. In their army, he was.